1970 was a year of excitement, development, hope and tragedy. Of course, every decade produces a new generation with ambitions to change the world, and it's naturally the young who are most rebellious. 1970 saw more than its fair share of student demonstrations in many parts of the world. Here at home, 18-year-olds voted for the first time in a general election. Labour seemed confident of victory, but the public's ultimate verdict swept Edward Heath and the Conservative Party into power with a healthy majority. Following serious rioting in Northern Ireland, British troops mounted a big security operation for the annual Orange Day parade, but trouble never came. Ulster stayed calm and the Catholics stayed away as the Protestants commemorated their victory at the Battle of the Boyne. But fears of renewed terrorism were aroused soon afterwards when a bomb explosion in a Belfast bank injured 30 people. In the Middle East, a new twist to the war as civil aircraft were blown up on landing strips. Then the spectacular hijacking of 3 airliners by Palestinian guerrillas. After holding passengers and crews hostage in the Negev desert, the terrorists destroyed the planes. The British passengers got home safely in the end, but security checks were intensified at all the world's major airports. Diplomats, too, became the target for extremists. Our trade commissioner in Montreal, James Cross, was kidnapped and held for 8 weeks. An American-initiated ceasefire brought a lull in the shelling across the Suez Canal, but we're still waiting for the start of top-level talks which could bring a negotiated settlement. President Nixon cut down the number of American troops on active service in Vietnam. While anti-Vietnam War protests are commonplace, this was a demonstration by Americans who support their country's continued participation. The 25th anniversary of the United Nations Charter was marked by a special service in Westminster Abbey. To mark Pope Paul's 50th year as a priest, he celebrated with the biggest mass ordination in living memory. And 1970 was a year in which natural disasters claimed many thousands of lives. Freak storms along the Italian Riviera caused Genoa's worst flooding for 2 years. The streets of Belfast were awash after Northern Ireland's heaviest storm since 1927. British troops took the opportunity to relieve the tension of the rioting by helping to evacuate stranded families. Last winter was one of the worst on record for avalanches. The ski resort of Val d'Isère in the French Alps was struck by a sea of snow in which nearly 50 perished. There was further devastation in eastern Peru after a lake high in the Andes burst its dams, sweeping away towns and villages. But without doubt, the biggest disaster of the year was in East Pakistan, where a tidal wave engulfed whole islands. Over 500,000 people died. Particularly tragic since many could have been saved if relief had been distributed with greater speed and efficiency. 2 long-established world leaders died in 1970. Egypt's President Nasser had personally intervened to halt the civil war in Jordan. 2 days later, he was dead. The strong man of the Middle East had earned respect from friends and enemies alike. His death was a cruel loss to his country. In Europe, that great soldier and statesman Charles de Gaulle passed away at his country home. Leader of the Free French during the last war, he retired from public life in 1946, only to return triumphantly when his country was on the brink of civil war over Algeria. After a decade at the helm, he staked his leadership on a relatively minor issue and lost. A great man, but above all, a great Frenchman. Another tragedy in France when nearly 150 young people died as fire gutted a dance hall near Grenoble. In Australia, several workmen lost their lives when a large section of this bridge under construction in Melbourne collapsed without warning. 1970 was also conservation year, but there was the threat of a widespread pollution of our beaches after the huge tanker Pacific Glory was involved in a collision off the southwest coast of Britain. Another pile-up which threatened to cause pollution was the accumulation of rubbish while most of the country's council workers went on strike. Until the dispute was settled, London was littered with great piles of rotting material. A prodigious amount of litter, too, as thousands of youngsters dropped everything to descend on the Isle of Wight for that ear-splitting pop festival. After 3 days of almost continuous beat music, the islanders were still trying to figure it out. Easier to figure out the Miss World contest, that annual frolic of fulsome femininity which creates so much ballyhoo. Even after the event, won this year by Jennifer Hoston of Grenada, there was more fuss about the decision. The 70s also saw the beginning of the jumbo era. The first transatlantic jumbo jet arrived at Heathrow, where a vast new jumbo terminal had been built. By 1975, it'll be coping with something like 30 million passengers a year from the big jets alone. But king of the big jets is the supersonic Concorde. 1970 saw a series of flight tests which took it to its design speed, twice the speed of sound. When it comes into service, it'll carry 144 passengers cruising at 1,400 miles an hour. Concorde was certainly the star of the Farnborough Air Show. It was a busy year for the royal family. In April, they undertook a tour of New Zealand and Australia. This welcome in the New Zealand capital was typical of their reception everywhere. Once again, the records show how much the strict formality of these occasions has been relaxed. Some of the most informal royal pictures ever taken came 3 months later when the Queen and Prince Philip, together with Prince Charles and Princess Anne, visited Canada's Northwest Territories. Buffalo steaks were the highlight of this friendly barbecue at Fort Smith. It was an exacting but exciting trip which brought the Queen into close contact with some of her most isolated subjects. She travelled to remote areas like Fort Providence, where the royal party had to smear themselves with insect repellent against the swarms of mosquitoes. 1970 was an important year for Prince Charles. As Prince of Wales, he represented his mother at Fiji's independence celebrations. The island had been a British colony for nearly 100 years. Chiefs and warriors assembled for the ceremony as the British flag was lowered for the last time, and Fiji became the 13th member of the British Commonwealth. Another historic moment for Prince Charles as he waits to take his seat in the House of Lords. It was almost 52 years since the last Prince of Wales had been introduced there. For the first time, Prince Charles and Princess Anne accompanied their parents at the state opening of Parliament, that elaborate ceremonial so much a part of our national heritage. And the new government was traditionally introduced by the constitutional monarch. Perhaps the biggest event of 1970 was the participation of 79 nations in Japan's fabulous Expo near Osaka. More than 100 specially designed pavilions on a site extending over 800 acres. A fitting curtain raiser to a memorable year, the theme was the progress and harmony of mankind. A noble ideal. Let's hope in this decade we may see the sunrise on a world that really is united in peace and understanding.